Okay, everyone, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce for a little talk back tonight. They're going to be speaking and then they'll take some questions from the audience. Tom Teicholz, Paula Apsell, and Michael Berenbaum.
Well, that was incredible. It's an amazing film. As Jen said earlier, you were for many years a executive at public television and an Emmy-winning producer of the Nova series, The Science Reporter. Why this film? Why this film now?
So this film was actually, it's inspired by a film that my co-director, Kirk Wolfinger, and I worked on together while I was still at Nova. I hope some of you have seen it. It was called Holocaust Escape Tunnel. And Professor Richard Freund, who's a geoarchaeologist who investigated more than 60 Holocaust sites, was working in Ponari Forest in Vilnius, Lithuania, Vilna. And there was rumored to be a tunnel that had been dug by 80 Jewish prisoners who were brought there to exhume and burn the bodies of the 100,000 victims that the Germans and their Lithuanian collaborators had murdered. And the tunnel had been rumored to exist, but nobody knew whether it really did or not. And as it turned out, the story was that on the last night of Passover, they used the tunnel to escape, and 12 of them made it into the forest where Abba Kovner and the partisans were waiting. So using their high-tech electronic equipment, Professor Freund and his team of archaeologists actually discovered that the tunnel, in fact, did exist. They found it. They can see underground with this equipment. And I happened to be there. I was the executive producer of Nova for 35 years. I used to talk endlessly about the moment of discovery, but I never was at any place ever where anybody discovered anything. But in 2016, I was there, and when they made this discovery, it was very exciting. But it soon began to occur to me, I'd never heard of this example of resistance, Jewish resistance, this incredibly brave effort to work all day exhuming and burning bodies, and then at night dig a tunnel when you could be, killed any second by the Germans or the Lithuanians. And I asked Dr. Freund that one day, and he, always a joker, he said, well, because you haven't made the film yet. So the idea that I had never heard of this tunnel or any other tunnel or any example of resistance except the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And that was probably very dumb of me, but a lot of people are in the same boat. And so when I retired from Nova in 2019, I started to research it. And I just found there was an incredibly rich story there, and one that many, maybe even most people, even Jews, maybe especially Jews, didn't know. So when you know you have a good story in your hands, you got to tell it.
Now, I want you all to know how lucky we are to have Dr. Michael Berenbaum with us tonight. He's not just on the faculty of American Jewish University or a scholar or author or the former editor of the American edition of the Encyclopedia Judaica. Michael has probably done more to communicate the Holocaust to people in more ways than anyone I know. If you have been to or heard of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, the Spielberg Survivors of Show Up project, even Holocaust museums in Belzec, Poland, and other locations. Michael It's Michael's work. So my question, Michael, is, given that you have worked on so many documentaries and so many Holocaust projects, why this one? Why did you become involved with this one?
First of all, Paul asked, and I can't say no very easily. Secondly, the subject itself is fascinating. And the other thing I want to point out is that Paula did something which, to my mind, is terribly important and marks a transition, which is that she used the children of survivors to tell the story of their parents. Now, that represents something for all of us. We all understand that in the life of the survivors, and we hope for the survivors here, they should live to 120 plus. But we understand that in the life of the survivors, we're now 1 minute to midnight, if not 30 seconds to midnight. And therefore, the idea that she was bridging the words of the survivors and the voices of their children, and the children that she used are not any children. They are people who have lived the story of their parents, who have researched it. Stephen Mead is the translator of Vladka's book. He translated it as a very young man. He retranslated it now as a mature person. He and Rita, Rita is also the daughter of survivors. They can finish each other's sentence. Bela Khazan's son has been working on his mother's story for years. Michael Kovner is the son of probably the most famous resistance fighter in Israel, who was a poet laureate of Israel. So I was also deeply moved by the fact that Paula showed us that we still have time to get the authenticity and the feel of what's there. And the combination of the request and the opportunity, and as my wife will know, I don't easily say no. And this was an offer that I could not refuse.
I suffer from the same disease. Paul, one of the things that's really striking and unusual is the decision you made to make a survey film, to tell multiple stories rather than one story. And clearly, within this film, any one of the stories could have been a whole film. But you chose to tell this survey. Tell us why you made that decision.
Well, making a survey film is really a terrible way to make a film, because you really you're saying a little about a lot, which can amount to saying nothing about anything. However, I felt so I agonized over this decision for a long time, but I felt that in this, because so few people knew anything more about Jewish resistance than the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, I felt that it was extremely important to get the whole picture. First of all, I myself was just fascinated and hadn't really ever thought or known anything about Amidah, this idea that resistance does not have to be with a gun, that there are many, many different ways to resist. And to me, I personally, that's really my favorite part of the film, because I felt that in all these ghettos, for people to risk their lives to resist, even though they had no weapons, they couldn't really fight back physically, but they could do it with acts of gimilut hasadim, loving kindness, of helping orphans, of feeding the poor, of following our Jewish tradition of charitable acts, that in itself was striking a blow and retaining their humanity. So I really fell in love with that aspect. Then, of course, there were 30,000 partisans in the forest. That's very important. And the Belsky story of saving Jewish lives instead of killing Germans, that to me, again, is just such an important value-laden story. And then resistance in the camps. I mean, I just love it when Professor Patrick Henry says that there were 7 uprisings in camps. First of all, I had no idea. It's hard to believe this ignorance in a person who was always interested in the Holocaust, and 6 of them were led by Jews. So to leave out any of this aspects and to forgo showing the evolution of resistance, I just felt that was kind of my mission.
Let me give just a pitch for Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust. One of the testimonies that you have right over the model of Sobibor is testimony of a man who made his home in California, and that is Tuvia Blatt, Thomas Blatt. And he tells his story, and he was a young kid, essentially, almost a shoeshine boy, messenger boy. But I have to tell one story with him, which is that I was at Sobibor with him, and I realized as we were climbing under barbed wire and into the woods that he periodically had to reenact his own escape to feel that he had really escaped. And consequently, I found myself on a spring afternoon, all muddied and wet and everything else, because he was reenacting and he went back to reenact it. But the other thing I want to say about Paula's part is that I've seen multiple cuts, and you're a professional filmmaker. So when you see what she left on the ground, you realize the greatness of what she gave. And the other story that we lost is that Bella Khazan was listed in Auschwitz as a non-Jew, and her son was determined to correct the record, as it were. He even lifted her picture from the wall so that she would not be there as a Polish prisoner, but as a Jewish prisoner, which was his act of resistance to recover his mother's memory. That's, again, one of the stories that was left behind. But to understand what a documentary filmmaker like Paula does all the time is you have to see what's there and how much is not there, because you have to cut. And I just spent this morning on a different film in which essentially it's a 2-hour and 35-minute film, just to get down to about 2 hours. And what you're doing is you're chopping vital elements. So there's multiple stories, and this is one hell of a talented woman, but we knew that going in.
Please, feel free. Please. Well deserved.
We knew that going in to be able to understand it. Let me also be a pain in the posterior historian for 1 second. The word resistance has 4 different connotations in all of the theaters of German occupation. One is symbolic resistance, which is finding a way to maintain your humanity. The second is polemical resistance, which is finding words, and this is Ringelblum and the poetry and Samuel Bach's art and all of the elements, polemical resistance. The third is what we call self-help. And the fourth and the final, which only comes very much when you don't have any other options and when you know you're going to die. And the question is, how do you live until you die? And in that sense, you hear the people in the forest, right? They were free. Not a good existence, but they were living without that. The world oppressed them, conditions oppressed them. and that's armed resistance. But for us, it's very important, and I'm going to preach for 10 seconds. It's very important to us, for us to understand that even when you face the utmost of oppression, you may have some dimension of agency, and we need to be resistant and resilient, even at this time, and especially at this
At
time.
this time, yes, no
So-
question.
One thing I'd like to say, Thomas, I have to do more cutting. I don't think I've told Michael that, because PBS has agreed to broadcast the film around January 27th, International Holocaust Remembrance Day. But it's going to be 90, which I think is 82 minutes. So I'm going to have to cut a few minutes out of it. So while I was sitting there,
She wants to say sorry, Michael.
no, not at all. Not at all. That won't go. But so I sort of decided my homework while I'm watching it, because I've seen this film a few times, is, okay, Paula, make some decisions, about cutting. And then it just, one thing that I have, which is just kind of a little thing, is I do not silence survivors. Those will never get cut out of my film. And so I started, and then I got such a headache from it that I just said, the hell with it, I'm not tonight.
I want to add that, the way these stories come to us, the story that became Schindler's List happened when the Australian novelist Thomas Keneally had to get his luggage repaired in Beverly Hills, and he walked into a shop to get his suitcase repaired, and the guy said, "What do you do for a living?" He said, "I'm a writer." And
I got a story for
he
you.
got a story. I went to see Thomas Blatt from Sobibor in Santa Barbara. Thomas Blatt installed car stereo systems in autos. That's what he did. But if you went to his car stereo place, you heard a story that was a great story. And we saw a little clip from Defiance, which was the film that Ed Zwick made about the Bielski brigade in the forests. And that project began when the original screenwriter, Clay Froman, got in a taxi cab in New York, and Tuvia Bielski was the cab driver. So, these stories, we are fortunate whenever we're able to gather them and then to have people like you and Michael tell them.
And I can't resist one story about Daniel Craig. Daniel Craig said this was terribly important to him for a very bizarre, unusual reason. He said, all of the films that I do as James Bond and all of that bring me to a world that is thoroughly distant from the world of my father. And I took this part, and my father sat me down and said that he was a liberator of Bergen-Belsen. And he said, this one you can't screw up. So he said, all of a sudden I had something in which my father was the instructor, and I became as it were, the pupil. And he said, I'll cherish that opportunity.
One more story
Please.
about that, because I spoke to Nechama Tech, who wrote the book Defiance, was too elderly at the point when I came into the picture on this. I tried to do an interview with her, but she was at that point very close to the end. But I did speak to her son, Roland Tech, who was one of the producers on Defiance. And he told me something that just astounded me, which is that even when they had Daniel Craig, the star, tied to the film, and they had this great book, and they obviously had an amazing story, even after that, it took them 9 years to get the film supported. So any of these stories that somehow we get to know, whether they're through feature films or books or documentaries, we are very, very lucky. And just think when you just think of the amount of luck, just think of all the stories out there that will never make it to our ears because people didn't survive to tell the tale, or somehow they never became known. So I think when we have to really appreciate these stories.
And I hope you're getting the sense that in seeing this particular film, we really were treated to some of the greatest personalities and some of the greatest historians. It's remarkable that Yehuda Bauer, who is 98 years old,
Young.
98 years young, is in this film. And I guess I wanted to ask both of you about how you chose and found the experts. Dina Porat, who you see in the film, is also a very well-known scholar in Israel. Tell us how you came to your experts,
Well-
including Charles Freund.
Well, like Michael, they're just so, the experts and the scholars especially are just so damn good that they kind of choose themselves, really. That's, I wish I could say, oh my God, it was so hard, and I'm so clever that I did it. No, they are wonderful scholars and wonderfully articulate. But I will tell you a little story about Yehuda Bauer, which I think is, you may have noticed in the film. So we filmed Yehuda Bauer. We had an Israeli crew there, and I was in my condo in Boston doing it because it was in the middle of COVID, and he's not the youngest person, and I was afraid, God forbid, what could happen, and I wanted him on it. So Yehuda, when he doesn't like the question, he doesn't actually suffer fools all that gladly. And there were quite a few questions I asked him he didn't like. But one of them is, I was really trying to get him, stupidly, to tie the name Amidah, nonviolent resistance, to the Amidah, the central prayer of the Jewish film service. Well, Yehuda Bauer is a very secular guy, and he was not going there. And when you saw that piece where he said, it doesn't matter if you're swimming or standing or walking or running, he was so irritated with me because I kept trying to push him to it because it seemed to me like that had to be obvious that there was a tie. But he was so annoyed. So after that, I didn't dare to ask him again.
I'll just say I studied with Yehuda Bauer when I was 19.
Wow.
So and
Just a little while
he
ago.
was a very young and vital, vibrant. He didn't suffer fools then either, which made it difficult to be in his class. But having said that, at 98, he feels an absolute freedom to say anything on his mind. And no filters whatsoever. And that's the advantage. He said, what are they going to do to me in that? The other thing that you have to understand for each of these scholars, they do the type of deep and profound work with lots of footnotes and lots of documents. And the opportunity to synthesize that to a general audience is an offer they can't refuse. So you have Gideon Greif, who's the leading authority on Sonderkommando. You have Javi Dreyfus, who's written a brilliant book on Warsaw, on the Warsaw Ghetto, and on Warsaw, and who's really the outstanding historian of the new generation of on the ghettos. You have Dina Porat, who wrote 2 books on Abba Kovner, and when you look at these, you have Yehuda Bauer, who's not only the dean, but the provost and the Dr. Vater of half the people in the film. So you look at these people, they have the opportunity. And the other thing, let's say, about the late and wonderful Richard Freund, Richard is one of the real pioneers of the archaeology of genocide. Let's say a word about the equipment. This is geothermal equipment, which is the new tool of archaeology. And the new tool of archaeology means that you can find out what's under there before you dig, and therefore you do less damage in digging. You save enormous costs. And the reason he got this equipment is because there was a slowdown in oil exploration in a region, and there was one person who was involved in assigning where these geothermal equipment goes, and he said, if you want it for a period of time, take it now, not tomorrow and not the next day, because if we had an assignment to explore for oil. So you're seeing the incredible tools that people have, and the incredible opportunities that are offered. So when Paula comes, everybody says yes, because it's the opportunity to bring forth what we know and to share it with the world. And when you get a wonderful filmmaker who does that, you're overjoyed to participate.
And these scholars also were the people who introduced me to the children of the survivors. I do want to say one thing about Richard Freund. You can see that he passed away. And he passed away when the film was at a fine cut, and he did see, 4 days before he died, he did see it, and he couldn't really talk at that point, but his wife, Eliane, told me he smiled all the way through it. So that, to me, is the mark of approval. But while we were shooting in the summer of 2021, Richard, who had had a bone marrow transplant, he was a leukemia victim, and he survived for more than 20 years, which is a miracle, and worked all the time, going to all of these places. And so in that summer, we went to Latvia, to Lithuania, and Poland with him. And he was very, very, very sick. But when I would ask him for an interview or to do something, first of all, he always brought students. This man would explain, his devotion was teaching. Most of his students were not Jewish. Many of them are now studying Jewish studies or some form of archaeology. He really made a mark on them. And whenever I would ask him, I needed him to do a scene or to interview, he would stand and deliver. I mean, the man was a sink bite machine, as we call it. And I was eternally grateful. I am eternally grateful because I know he was very, very sick, and it took a toll.
I just wanted to add to our reminiscences about Yehuda Bauer that I also, Yehuda Bauer came to my parents' apartment to interview my father. And my father appears in Bauer's book, Flight and Rescue, about the Bricha. And my mother, whole time tried...
Explain what Bricha is for 1 second.
Yeah, Bricha is after the war ended. After the war ended, there was the illegal emigration to what was then Palestine, which became Israel, and there was a tremendous amount of sending the survivors there in unconventional routes. And my father was one of the leaders.
We never call it illegal; it's extra legal.
Extra legal, and also sending arms there, and it was also part of the pre-Mossad. It was sort of like the OSS's to the CIA. The Bricha was the establishment of intelligence networks throughout Europe and to Israel. But my mother kept trying to, as a good Hungarian Jewish woman, kept trying to feed him cookies. And he would not be, dissuaded from doing the interview. He just wanted to, get the work done. So that was my Bauer recollection. But I was struck also, and maybe you have a thought about this, Michael, that we have these poets, Abakovner, Sutskever, who are resistance fighters. We don't think of poets as fighters.
let's begin. Kovner also remained a fighter. I mean, Dina Porat's second book is called Revenge. And it's called Nakama, Revenge, or Vengeance. And the interesting thing about Kovner is Kovner came out of the woods and wanted revenge on the Germans. And he got something incredible. He wanted to poison the water supply of 6 million Germans. He went and got the poison that was adequate to the task, and he was foiled only on the boat coming back to Europe with the poison because somebody discovered what he had and forced him to send it into the Mediterranean Sea. They did poison the bread supply of the SS, and there was a tremendous tension. So Kovner, and you have to understand, these people living in the woods had lived outside of civilization for as long as 3 years. No laws, no support system, no city, no village, no town, no food. They even to provide food, they developed their own moral code, which is that they would try to find farmers who were willing to help them with food. They would then have a hierarchy. You did not steal from a poor farmer. You stole from a rich farmer. Your preference was to steal from a farmer who had been collaborating with the Germans and supplying them with food. Once you found such a farmer, then it was a privilege to steal. It wasn't merely an opportunity, it was a privilege to steal, and they would then burn the rest of those supplies. So when Kovner came out of this, he was incredible. Now, Sutzkever is an interesting story in one other way.
I'm just going to pause you for 1 second there. Next week's movie is about Sutzkever that we're showing. So now.
Sutzkever is an interesting story because you have one little tidbit in this. Samuel Bach, who's one of the great artists of this generation, and who's now in his probably as much as 91 or 92, continues to paint, and most of his material deals with a fragmented, broken world in all sorts of ways. But he had his first exhibition at 9 years of age, sponsored by Sutzkever in Vilna, because Sutzkever was not only a resistance figure, but also was a leader of the cultural resistance. And if there are many people, to give you the sense of Sutzkever, if you ask Yiddish scholars who should have gotten the Nobel Prize in Literature for Yiddish, almost every Yiddish reader will say it's Sutzkever and not Isaac Bashevis Singer. Isaac Bashevis Singer would have said it's Isaac Bashevis Singer, and I should have gotten it earlier.
He might have said his brother. He might have said his brother. But I just
only on a day when he was in a very good mood.
And there weren't a lot of days like that. I just want to add one thing that to your story about Kovner. From my father's group of agents in Austria and Vienna, after the war, Adolf Eichmann was said to be dead, and his widow and his children were still living. And so they sent someone to watch her, to figure out if there was any contact from Eichmann, who was still alive. And there was a moment, and there was a question of whether the agent might try and seduce Eichmann's wife or not. But there was a day when she was out on a lake, alone with her children in a boat. And for a moment, he thought about murdering them. And he decided against it. but those moments occurred.
If you're interested in Sutskever's poetry, on the website of the film, which is theyfoughtback.com, you can see a film clip. There are a number of film clips that weren't included in the final film. You can see his granddaughter, Hadass Calderon, who is an Israeli actor, read at the Lele Theater, which is a theater in Vilna, which was a theater during the war in the ghetto and is still an operating theater, and very beautiful, very small but beautiful. And she very beautifully and movingly reads his poem in English and with some a little bit in Yiddish.
I think that's like a perfect place to end our discussion, but I'm going to give the final word to Paula. You went into this film not really knowing much about resistance. Tell us what you feel now about that subject. And how it applies to today, if you'd like to not hit that one out of the park.
Yeah, you saved the hardest for last.
Of course.
Surprise. I mean, to me, as a person, as a Jew, I feel that to know what little I know about the story, because there is a much bigger story than what I know. For example, and I did want to link this to what you asked about Najari. Najari was Greek. He was a Sephardic Jew. And sometimes I think we Ashkenazis think of the Holocaust as an Ashkenazi phenomena. But the Greek story is phenomenal, and it's barely been told, and certainly not in film. So that's really great to know. So I feel that as an individual, just to know the story, but as a journalist and a filmmaker, to have been entrusted with this story and to have been able to raise the money due to the generosity of my 58 generous contributors, to which I am grateful for each and every one, and to be able to tell the story and now to distribute it, which is probably the greatest challenge. To me, that as a journalist, and I've supervised like some 700 films, this to me is the greatest gift, for which I am very thankful that I had the strength and I had the support of my family and my beloved husband, and Richard Freund and Michael and all the other people, and thanks also to the LA Holocaust Museum for choosing to show it tonight. I'm very grateful.
And with that, I thank Michael and Paula, and I thank all of you for coming. If you like this film series, feel free to donate to the museum, to the series. No donation is too small, and no donation is too large. Thank you.